Now, Hannah Kent is a writer whose novel Burial Rites took us to Iceland in the 1820s. Long, dark winters, earth houses, dramatic landscapes, and an execution. Her second went to Ireland, and her latest, and our focus today, Devotion, moves between Germany and Australia in the 19th century. Hi, Hannah.
Hello, Kate. It's so lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
Now, Kate Forsyth weaves stories from objects, among other things, but has published dozens of books, many of which retell fairy tales and mythologies from fresh and historical perspectives, as she did, for example, in the novels Blue Rose and Bitter Greens, but it's both ancient and modern Greece that come together in her latest, and our focus today, a book that is not quite out, so you're getting a bit of a sneak peek, it'll be out in a few weeks, The Crimson Thread. Nice to talk to you again, Kate.
Thank you so much. It's so lovely to be here on such a glorious day. Aren't you lucky living here? It's beautiful.
Well, thinking of living here, Felicity McLean is a journalist and a novelist who also explores mythologies, but they're mythologies much closer to home. There's Disappearing Girls in The Van Apfel Girls Are Gone, and a wild larrikin girl who evokes a familiar Australian figure, who we'll hear about in a moment, in her new novel Red. Hi, Felicity.
Hi, Kate. Thank you very much for having me here today.
Well, when I say closer to home, Felicity, your novel bikes us through these streets where we are now on the Central Coast. We run along beaches, maybe run a coin along a police car on the way. So can you begin by introducing us to your character, Red?
Sure. So Red is a feisty, red-headed teenage girl, and her story is essentially a very contemporary retelling of the Ned Kelly story. So I've taken Ned Kelly, like a good New South Wales person, I've pinched Ned Kelly from the Victorians and brought Ned Kelly's story to the Central Coast because the Ned Kelly story is nothing if not a Western. So Red ricochets around between suburbs like Wyoming and Saratoga and San Remo, and does spend a lot of time at Woy Woy, which is just up the road. And yeah, so Ned Kelly is now a female living in the 1990s because that was the era just before the Wood Royal Commission into police corruption. And so the Central Coast was full of police corruption at the time.
Well, yes, there hangs a tale, and you've alluded to some of that history and royal commissions in the naming of one character in particular. But Kate Forsyth, you know, this character Red is a sort of larrikin Australian, and there's something of the larrikin in one of the characters in your novel, The Crimson Thread. But I'm interested in the way that you sort of turn that Anzac larrikin idea on its head with your character Teddy. But before we get to that, this novel of yours, it's set on Crete during World War II. Why?
It's quite a personal reason, actually, and that is because my great uncle fought in Greece and on Crete, and he was involved in the Battle of Crete and was one of the, 32,000 Anzac soldiers who fought there, and many of them lost their lives there. And I first heard the story of my great uncle and this desperate battle when I was, I guess I would have been about 12 or 13, staying with my grandparents. And I heard the story at the same time that I was reading the Greek myths, and I read the story of the minotaur in the labyrinth. And so the conjunction of these two events in my young life, the reading of the Greek myths and then this incredibly heroic struggle to try and save the people of Crete from the German invasion, they kind of fixed themselves in my memory. And just one more thing that really made me think about the war in Greece so much. My great uncle's brother, who was also fighting for the empire in the Second World War, after he came back to Australia, he was married and lived in Melbourne. He had terrible post-traumatic stress syndrome, and he was drinking a lot and he was violent. And one day he went out to buy a loaf of bread from the local milk bar and he never came home. He just disappeared. And so the mystery of what happened to my great uncle who had fought in the war was this great kind of hole in my childhood. And so those three things, the Greek myths, the Battle of Crete, and this ex-soldier who just walked out of his life and his family and disappeared one day, those three things started this lifelong fascination with the island of Crete and the war there.
And you refer to a book of myths there, and there are books of myths through all of your books, and we'll talk about that in a moment too. But Hannah Kent, we're doing this discussion almost in the reverse order chronologically. So 1990s, 1940s, and then your book, Devotion, takes us back to the 1830s in Prussia and Australia. So why Prussia?
I think so much of Devotion began with a fascination of the landscape, that I grew up in, which is Paramount Country, the Adelaide Hills, a place of exquisite natural beauty. And for a long time I was very interested in the very strong, inheritance that we have received of German culture in many of these places since the colonisation of South Australia. And I started doing some reading into these communities who arrived in the Adelaide Hills and these German-speaking Prussians. And what I discovered is that many of these people emigrated from Prussia in the 1830s because they were being persecuted for refusing to subscribe to King Frederick William III's Union Church. They insisted on retaining their usual modes of service, and they became persecuted for that and were fined and imprisoned. And they ended up being offered, a loan to come out to the colony of South Australia. And speaking of myths, one of the things that always made me curious about these people, and one of the reasons why I started reading about them and researching them, was because I had always, growing up in this place, received this kind of mythology of the hard-working, pious pioneer. And it kind of got to the point where their memorialisation had actually eviscerated any semblance of recognisable humanity that had been made into saints in my local community. So I think a big starting point with this book was to try and actually pull apart that myth and recognise the humans, the complex, messy, squabbling humans, these emigrants at the heart of it.
Well, complex, messy and squabbling, but also it's such a story of longing and desire as well. But I'd really like us to sort of assemble the three young women who are at the heart of all of your books. So, Felicity, you've started to talk about this girl, Red, but tell us more about not just her character, but her family as well as we meet her.
So Red lives with her father Sid, who is a small-time crim. He thinks of himself as an entrepreneur, but he's a small-time criminal. He's interested in doing all sorts. He's full of ideas like, getting out his tinny and undercutting the Woy Woy ferry and, servicing people in that way. And so he's always got something on the go, but he becomes embroiled in police-sanctioned corruption. There is Sergeant Healy from the Wyoming police station who seems to have a very personal vendetta against Red and the whole McCoy family, and it seems to go back generations. And so her father becomes involved in police-sanctioned copper theft, so stealing copper and on selling it. And the more we uncover about the McCoy family and their past, we see that their past is very much entwined with Sergeant Healy's family's past. And I guess I was interested in looking at the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. So the personal family histories that we tell ourselves, and have we got all the facts, and what are the family histories that are perpetuated across generations, and at the same time, what are the national stories or the national myths we tell ourselves about ourselves, which is, the Ned Kelly story being one of those.
And on a sort of intimate and personal level, one of the stories that Red might tell about herself is that she'd never back down from a dare, which might include something like drinking an entire glass of undiluted cordial.
Yes. Yes, there's a list included of all the dares that Red would never back down from. Things like eating chewing gum off the B55 Ettalong bus floor.
But there was something about the cordial that was like, whoa. But Kate, introduce us to Alenka.
So at the heart of my novel, The Crimson Thread, is what I like to call a bizarre love triangle, which I know dates me terribly, but this idea of this intense triangle of conflicting emotions. Alenka is a young Cretan woman who has been brought up at Knossos, which is it's called the most ancient city in Europe. It's one of the oldest human civilizations, the Minoan civilization on Crete. And the palace of Knossos is the epicenter of the minotaur in the labyrinth myth. So she's a young Greek woman. She's been brought up in this place of incredible beauty and myth and history. And the novel opens as the Nazis march down the flank of Mount Olympus and into Greece, where they are met by a combined force of the British, American, New Zealand, and of course the local Greeks. So, the novel begins with her world is changing very, very rapidly. And she, first of all, she is dealing with the fact that her country is being invaded, an unprovoked attack. Her friends and family are fighting for their lives. And then, as an act of defiance and resistance, she helps save the life of these two young Australian soldiers, and she hides them under under German occupation. About 12,000 Australian soldiers were hidden in cellars and caves and churches and under floorboards and in attics by the people of Crete. They were unable to get them off the island because Crete is so inaccessible, and so many of our young soldiers were hidden at enormous risk to the Greek people, and that's what Alenka does. And
and I've just realised that bravery deployed in all different ways is something else that happens in all three of your books. Hannah, you mentioned this community in Prussia, who were already a community of outsiders, religiously, politically, but within that community, your character Hannah is even described as a sort of, her mother thinks of her even as a sort of cuckoo in the nest. So tell us more about this young woman.
So Hannah is the protagonist in my novel. Can you hear me? Is this on? Hannah is the protagonist in my novel. She is the daughter of an elder within the Lutheran Church, and her mother is someone who, in every way, fulfills the societal role expected of women who belong to this community. She's a very dutiful wife and mother. She's very proper. Everything is in its place. She's very hardworking. But Hannah feels that intrinsically she is different from her parents. She is someone who possesses a kind of synesthesia. She hears the natural world speak to her. She can hear the sound of sunlight, the music, trees speak to her. So she has this very, almost sort of pantheistic attachment to the natural world. And when she's a child, she loves to go out and be in this world for that reason. But when the book opens, she's at that point of her life where the pressure for her to mould herself into a young, desirable woman who will be married off and do as is expected within this close community has become very great. And she's struggling, I guess, under the weight of this expected womanhood. As you say, is very much considered a cuckoo within her family, not only for these sort of differences in behaviour, but also she looks very different. She has a twin, Matthias, who resembles their parents, but she is tall and ungainly, and she doesn't feel comfortable in becoming a woman. She misses her child's body. She doesn't know how to be with her peers in the village, and she's very much a loner, I think, in many ways, until, as the book progresses, she meets the daughter of newcomers to this village, who seems to accept these things which initially she not despises within herself, but is so uncomfortably conscious of.
And that, I guess, gets us to something else that connects your books, which is a book. So Felicity, as Ruby Red is screaming around the Central Coast at one point, she hears a splash. Something has happened in the sea. She rescues a classmate, Stevie, who is a bit of a storyteller. He makes everything grand and mythic in his own way. But as a sort of reward for saving him from drowning, Stevie's mother gives her a book. What is it?
So the book is The Golden Treasury of Greek Mythology, which is something that Red has never encountered before in her life, anything like this book. And it's a green covered book, and she's just absolutely obsessed with these Greek stories of gods and goddesses and feisty women mostly. She really likes the story of the Keres, which are the Greek goddesses of fury and vengeance. And it sounds, Keres, if pronounced probably incorrectly, sounds a little bit like Kelly's. But the idea behind the Green Book is actually from the original Ned Kelly story. So Ned Kelly, when he was quite young, rescued a fellow classmate from the creek. This kid was drowning in the creek, and Ned Kelly was walking past and dragged him out and rescued him. And this boy's family ran the local pub, and they gave Ned Kelly a green sash, which apparently he was really taken with. This green sash was a real source of pride for him. And I understand he was wearing the sash when he was killed at the end of his days. Ned Kelly was wearing this green sash. He was so proud of it still. And so I wanted Red to have a green object that really changed the direction of her life, and so a book it had to be.
Well, and not just any book, of course. Now, Kate Forsyth, you've already said that you read a collection of Greek myths as a child, but also in your career as a writer, you have often taken mythologies and then sort of written into them and around them and used them as the basis of your storytelling. Why?
That's a very big question.
Yes, it is.
The main reason, I think, is because they are so old and they're so human. And I think that, for me, books and stories have been incredibly important all through my life, because I was a very sick little girl. I spent a lot of time in hospital, and I was very constrained in my physical body. They have those horrible hospital beds with the bars that they put up, clunk, and I always had drips and machines hanging off me, and my body was immobilized. Even when I wasn't in hospital, I wasn't allowed to do much because everything would make me sick. And so books were a portal for my imagination, a means for me to fly free, to escape the prison of my body, of my illness, of my loneliness and fear as a sick child. And so I was always seeking that experience of transportation. Fairy tales are integral to us as human beings because they're the first time that we actually experience transportation as children, because they're often the very first tales that any of us ever encounter. For me, they were stories, fairy tales in particular, nearly always about young women who are transforming themselves in their world. And so they offered me that sense of escape, but also consolation, comfort, hope that I too could change my world, that I too could escape my imprisonment. The myths are often more male-centric, but I've always loved the story of Ariadne and the labyrinth in the Minotaur. I think because it's one of the few Greek myths that has the cleverness of a woman at its heart. It's really a story about Ariadne, not about Theseus, particularly as you go further and further and further back in time, which is what I like to do. I like to go back to the oldest known source of a story, because that tells me what the people who invented that story, what they were dreaming of, what they were hoping for, what change they wanted to enact in their own lives.
Hannah, those ancient stories of transformation, of women being transformed, whether it's into another creature or into another, way of being. Is that something that you were thinking of as your character Hannah is transformed in quite interesting ways in your novel, in ways that I won't reveal, just by the way, if anybody hasn't read it?
I was going to say it's going to be quite difficult to talk to this without giving away too many spoilers. I think, just to go off what Kate was saying, I don't think I necessarily deal so much with myths or fairy tales in my work, but one thing that I am always very interested in is superstitious behaviour and sympathetic magic. So things like the practice of herbalism and so forth. And I thought in writing this book, writing about a very religious community, I wouldn't necessarily be touching on any of that. And the opposite was true. The more I sort of peered beyond this facade of these hymn-singing Lutherans in the Adelaide Hills, the more I discovered this very rich history of incredibly superstitious behaviour. And at the centre of that was this amazing apocryphal text, this grimoire of magic, which, in fact, you can go to places like Harndorf now and look at the old villages and the cottages which are preserved and still see the places in the ruins where these these congregations hid this magical text. And it was usually used by women who wanted to, there were no doctors in these communities, who wanted to heal, but also, and I think this is what is so interesting, used by women who perhaps sought agency and control over their lives, perhaps whether or not they ever received that. I think the possession of texts like this gave them at least a sense that they were doing something to enact change or to protect themselves. And this is what I'm interested in, I think, across all of my novels, the way in which so many of these texts or these superstitions or, ghost stories, things like that are interesting, absolutely, in and of themselves, but what they really say and speak to are the fears and desires, particularly of women. And I think this is something that, as much as I think, I'm not going to do it in this book, I always end up circling back to it.
Yes.
And so that's where, again, each of these books have a book or a number of books in it. But Felicity, in yours there is a whole other sort of mythic text in terms of Australian nationalist stories, and that is Ned Kelly's letter. So how did you either imagine or write the relationship between the story of this scrappy girl on the Central Coast and Ned Kelly's Jerilderie letter?
Yes, well, that was one of the most interesting things I discovered, was the Jerilderie letter is terrific reading. I had never read it. Go away and read Ned Kelly's original letter. It is, like the adjectives themselves, he's calling the police, wombat-headed, magpie-legged, bullies, and he's like, I can't even do it justice. It's wonderful reading. And it is just this rush of run-on sentences and, urgency to get his story out, which is what I wanted to capture in this book too. Here's a girl who, she's got your attention for a minute and she's been voiceless because she's a girl, because she's, she's not from a wealthy family. She's finally got her chance to have her say, and she's not going to draw breath until she's finished her story. I really wanted to capture that side of things from the Jerilderie letters.
It's almost sounding like, and I can't remember the word for it, there's in those Icelandic myths, there's that particular form where they're putting words together in a very particular sort of mythic form. Perhaps you could give us just a few sentences to give us that sense of the voice that you've created by mirroring the Jerilderie letter, and if you want to grimace and not do it, we'll just move on to something.
That's okay. I'll start on page 1 because I haven't prepared anything.
It's always a good place to start.
Yeah. First off, Sid had promised that Datsun was gold. To be honest, it wasn't even bronze, but what did I care? I must have only been 4 or 5 years old the day we collected Sid's car from Wyoming and drove it the long way home. Just the two of us, Sid and me, in the full dazzle of summer sun, and the whole time Sid singing Hi Yo Silver, though that Datsun's supposedly gold. Yeah, we drove it home in the sunshine singing Hi Yo Silver. It's the earliest memory of my dad that I've got.
And it is such a vibrant voice, and this combination of, I guess, the Jerilderie letter and a sort of police witness statement as well. Sorry, and I got slightly distracted by putting you on the spot there by making you read something. Kate, something I alluded to earlier, just thinking of Australian mythologies and the way we mythologise ourselves and the claims we make about the Anzac myth and larrikins. And in this novel of yours, you have a character who is playing out some of those archetypal Anzac larrikin, tropes. But he's not a sympathetic character, and I think it's making us question those things we know about, or think we know about the Anzac. So I wonder if you could talk about that character of Teddy and what you're doing there.
So I said before that there's a love triangle at the heart of my book. Two young Australian soldiers who are saved and hidden by this young Greek girl. I guess what I was trying to do is also examine the original myth. So I don't know how much you remember about the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur in the labyrinth, but most retellings of the tale are done by men, and Theseus is the hero. He goes into the labyrinth. Ariadne gives him a sword, and he kills the Minotaur. And then he flees with her. He's promised to help her escape and marry her, and then he abandons her and and goes on to have his life. So there's this incredible betrayal at the heart of the original myth, which is nearly always written out of modern retellings of the tale, which have always been done by men up until now. So I guess what I was trying to look at was think about what it would be like to be the woman at the heart of the tale, the woman who herself betrays her half-brother, leads him to his death, leads him, why she would make that great betrayal of her own blood and her own kin. And also, it's got a lot to do with it about consent, about who has the right over a woman's body, over her choice, of who she gives her love to, this sense of ownership, which I see was at the heart of the original myth. So I was playing out that ancient myth. The story of Ariadne and the labyrinth is at least 5,000 years old, one of the most ancient human myths, and I'm playing it out on a modern stage of war and resistance and defiance and anger and this idea that one country can just invade another country, or a man can take a woman because he wants her. To me, they're all linked together.
Mm. Well, and I'm glad you mentioned love and who it is that we're allowed to love or not, because Hannah, your novel is also a love story, but it's it's a queer love story that is also historically placed. So how did you, what did you have to grapple with to make this story a historical story? And what did you want to do there?
Well, I had actually already decided to write about these communities of Lutherans and this particular time in the colonisation of South Australia before I had made the decision to turn it into a queer love story. Part of my sort of looking at what is absent, what are the received silences from, the narratives we kind of hear, the stories we receive as kids. I'm always interested in what's not spoken of, and one thing that always struck me with these communities was that the women were just never really mentioned. And I'm related to a lot of these immigrants on my grandmother's side, and my grandmother was quite an extraordinary woman, but she was also someone who would never have spoken about herself or her life. And I kind of had the sense that this would have been true. And so I started to think about maybe centering friendship between women against this backdrop of emigration. And then we had the plebiscite in 2017. And I was pregnant with my partner's first child, and I was completely unprepared for this wave of this feeling of powerlessness in the face of all this kind of these awful vitriolic pamphlets we started receiving in our letterbox. And it made me reconsider what I was doing as a writer, and it made me started considering the power of representation. And I realised that the only way I could process these feelings of anger and sorrow and frustration was to change the story and turn that friendship that was going to be the centre of this book into a queer love story. And I knew in doing that I was never going to find anything in the archives. You so rarely come across, if you do find evidence of queer relationships, they're very rarely, articulated by people who are within them. It's always a narrative of shame. And it was because of at this time where so many people in the queer community were being made, shame was being pressed up against us. It was an awful year. It made me think, okay, can I write a queer love story, but also can I maintain the historical context but write it in such a way that I don't have to make it a narrative of shame? So by that I mean the characters must be clear-eyed about their feelings. They must not be ostracised. The cost of being together means that you have to be, you have to flee, essentially. I didn't want them to be punished. I didn't want them to punish themselves. And then I thought, God, that sounds just difficult enough to try and make it work. And I think that's probably why this book, I ended up taking some other sort of creative risks in this book, but I think that was the only way I felt I could do it, to write a queer love story within this historical setting, but at the same time to kind of circumvent what probably would have been likely at that time.
But what an extraordinarily generous answer in terms of taking something that you were grappling with personally and politically and then showing us what you do creatively to turn it into an extremely powerful novel. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Felicity, something else, just in terms of the sort of mythologies that we all live with, some of it is the stories we know about the police and how policing works. And you mentioned that, you set this around the time of inquiries into police action. And one of your characters, a sort of side character, is called Chook Fowler. And I know I can remember that videotape that was made inside a car of a cop called Chookie Fowler taking a brown paper bag of money. So deciding to explore, so tell us about your decision to explore the police and police corruption, because I guess you're alluding to both the 19th century and the 1990s.
Yeah, that came about in a really roundabout way. So the starting point was the Ned Kelly story rather than police corruption, although once I decided I was going to go down that path of Ned Kelly, I looked for an era where police corruption, where it was plausible for there to be corrupt police wandering around. And 1990s in New South Wales, just immediately prior to the Wood Royal Commission, seemed like an obvious choice. And again, that was some fantastic reading. The report into police corruption, amazing stories of, drugs being planted in people's houses and bribes and money exchanging hands and just the most hair-raising things. You couldn't make up half of them. A lot of what I've done is base it on facts from the police corruption report and change the names and the circumstances, obviously, for legal reasons. But a lot of the more hair-raising stories are grounded in fact. But I did really come to... So the thing that intrigued me first was the Ned Kelly story, and the police corruption sort of came from that. But when I first had the idea to even tackle the Ned Kelly story, I thought that is a frankly audacious thing to do. Like, what a sacred cow in Australian history. Nobody in their right mind would touch that, let alone turn Ned Kelly into a girl. But the more I thought about it, the more I was just intrigued by this idea that we think of ourselves as a larrikin nation. We love an underdog. We think we're lovable rogues. And I just wondered how much that still applied to Australia in 2022. I mean, are we really as audacious, and are we the larrikins we think we are? Sometimes I wonder if we're much more politically conservative. I mean, it's the Queen's Jubilee this weekend, and she's still our queen. She's been on the throne for 70 years and we still haven't gotten around to becoming a republic yet. And when you think about how little action we've taken on Indigenous rights, say, I just feel like maybe we're much more conservative than we think we are as a nation. We think we're a bunch of Ned Kellys and we're lovable larrikins, but are we really? And I thought the only way to think again, to see ourselves in a fresh light, to really rethink this story that we tell ourselves, this is who we are, was to turn it on its head a bit. So we can look at it with fresh eyes and go, maybe that's not who we are. And if that's not who we are we now? And maybe the Ned Kelly story is as out of place for us now, or as, anachronistic a representation of who we are now as, say, a Greek myth or an American Western, or, maybe it's not who we are now. And if not, who are we?
And if you're wondering how some of the most famous iconography of Ned Kelly gets into this book, just keep an eye out for a car door that's been ripped off in a junkyard, just as my one little clue. But if what we're talking about here today is history and mythology, that's part of what we're talking about, well, you're novelists, you're storytellers, so you three are actually the goddesses of the worlds that you create.
We are the goddesses of the world! Thank you, Kate. I'll claim that one.
Well, I think you can all claim that one, which means you can decide the rules in the worlds that you create.
I think we can all claim that one. Everyone here.
Well, except my question is, no, that's all right. Because yours, Kate, is a story about real blood and betrayal and politics in Crete on World War II, there's heroism, there's betrayal, it's all in there. What, as a fiction writer, what do you owe history?
Oh, it's a really, really good question. It's, I think, at the heart of writing historical fiction, isn't it? What we're trying to do is we're trying to conjure up the past. We want to make it live again. We want to make sure that, that we are listening to history so that we can try and learn to do better. It's about, being a time traveller. But there's this tension, I think, between being a historian and being a storyteller. History, what we know of history is always a constructed narrative, always. We all know that saying that history is written by the victors. I'm always drawn to the untold story. I was really struck by what Felicity said earlier about a young woman who was voiceless. Because that's if I'm ever asked, what do you do? I say, well, I endeavour to give voices back to those who have had their voices taken from them, who've been rendered mute. And particularly, I'm drawn to telling the stories of women, the forgotten stories of women. I do think that we have a responsibility to our readers to try and find some kind of truth in the constructed histories that we've been told. To go back to stories that have been forgotten or which have been forcibly erased, which I think is something you do so beautifully in Devotion, Hannah. But there is that tension, because our job is to enchant and entertain as much as it is to teach and transport. And I think that tension is actually where the excitement of being a writer comes from. The excitement, what drives us to tell these stories is how we can make them feel real to the reader, and how they can recognise themselves and their own lives in the stories of people whose stories have been forgotten.
And it is a very complex job that you're all doing. And Hannah, we haven't even touched on, the mythic journey at the centre of your book, which is so beautifully done. And it's both, I think, sort of mythic in an ancient sense, and also the story of migration. You're connecting us to Aboriginal presence in Australia as well. But how do you understand that relationship between history and fiction in the work that you do?
Gosh, it's such a big question. You can just talk endlessly about these things. I think, just to reiterate a lot of what Kate has just said, I feel that I have a deep respect for history, but I'm certainly not a historian. And I think this is the difference, right? I think as a novelist, again, I'm drawn to what is untold. It's what is not there. It's very much, I think, a lot of my attraction to historical stories are never the stories that I first hear. It's always the other side, or the gaps in there. That's what sort of drives my curiosity. And what drives my writing is that kind of questioning. And I think I write books to try and find answers to my questions. Were these people really like that? What about the other side of the story? And I write these books, like I say, and these questions kind of guide my research. But then what I realised by the end of writing these books is I never have a book of answers, I just have a book of more questions. And I think this is what I also enjoy about it. I spend a lot of time researching. I think it is important to try and understand what has happened, and I create myself a kind of, it sounds terrible, but kind of an ethical methodology in terms of approaching the past, honouring what is known, what has been corroborated, but also being very aware of the fact that, you know, facts are very rarely exactly that. They are filled of prejudice. They reflect the ideologies of the time. So I consider writing historical fiction kind of assembling a world out of what has been received, but creating a world that then can turn back and interrogate exactly those same facts, if that makes sense. So it's, I think it's, I feel that novelists and storytellers do a wonderful job of presenting the possibility of multiple truths, and it's this idea, you know, this dismantling of a singular truth, which is often what we end up receiving when time has elapsed and stories have been kind of compressed into myth. Kate articulated that much more better. Case in point, she articulated it much more elegantly than I ever could. But I would say that the motivation remains the same.
But there's also such a commitment, really interesting commitment to place and the way that you write about place, and you've got the sort of dark German forest of fairy tales, as well as that's this sense of sort of dancing the landscape in South Australia too. But thinking of place, Felicity, I mean, I'm wondering, given that, you know, you've set your novel here and you've got a local audience, so what does that mean for the veracity of fiction? I mean, does that mean that if you move a fish and chip shop into the wrong street, you're in trouble?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about this. So I've spent a lot of time coming to the Central Coast. I don't live here, but I have spent all my childhood holidays were on the Central Coast. My grandparents lived just up the road at Saratoga, and so, you know, these were our beaches, we owned them every school holidays. So I felt like I knew the area and I knew the time frame, because, you know, it's fine to be on a panel talking about historical fiction, but my novel is set in the 90s, and as far as I'm concerned, that's not historical fiction. I remember the 90s. I was well and truly alive. But yes, there is a certain responsibility, and I feel like if you're going to put details in, you need those details to be accurate. There's nothing more irritating than when you read something and you go, actually, that fish and chip shop wasn't on that street, it was a block back. Or that fish and chip shop had gone by the time that you're writing about. So, yes, you do really need to do your homework. I think you can't start mucking around with it until you've done your research and done your homework and you're pretty sure you've got it right. But I did put a disclaimer at the front saying, look, liberties have been taken here. There is a certain amount of invention, because sometimes you just need something to serve the story. So there is a certain amount of invention in there as well.
Well, and I know that sometimes readers even take writers to task about fictional places that they've created. And I remember interviewing once the writer Sue Grafton, who had, just before she died, I think she'd done 22 or 23 in her Kinsey Millhone series. And sometimes writers would say, you know, that was a one-way street in an earlier book. And again, and her line was, I'm the goddess of this town, I created it, and so if I change the traffic, so be it. Yes. But on that sort of ridiculous note, that's probably a good opportunity for us to turn to questions, if you wouldn't mind, questions, not statements, from the floor. And we do have microphones. Don't be shy, because this is an opportunity for you to speak to these fine writers. And if you wouldn't mind waiting for a microphone so that we can all hear you. But who would like to start? In the front row.
I'm curious about your writing styles, like how and when do you do it? Your writing habits is when the children are asleep, when they're at school, you know, all those sorts of things.
How do you do it and when?
How about we just do it all one after the other? So can I say that only my first published novel was written without children. And I had quit full-time job as a journalist in order to write, and I decided I was going to approach my writing as if it was my true work, as if it was a business. So I was at my computer at 9 or 9:30 and I worked through to the end. Then, of course, I had children, which I know, I'm sure Hannah's going to talk about this as well, how disruptive having children is to a beautifully arranged writing schedule. I always wrote around my children. I always, I began by writing in the cracks of the day. Quite a few of my early novels were written between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., which was when the boys would wake up. I only was able to become a full-time writer when all 3 of my children were at school. It was my golden year when they were all 3 in primary school, and that was when I wrote Bitter Greens, my most difficult book. This year is the first year that I have no children of children age. They're all adults now. And I don't know how to build my routines anymore. I'm just doing what I've always done because that's what I do. So basically, writing for me is something that I write every day, but every day is different. It depends what crisis there is going on in the family at that time. I'll just tell you one more thing before I pass it along. I always had an open door policy with my study, so any of my children could come in and interrupt me at any time. We only had 2 rules. One was I had to be able to finish my sentence, and 2, they were only allowed to interrupt me if there was tears, snot, blood, or visible bone.
So if you're vomiting, don't interrupt Mum.
Exactly.
I love even if there's visible bone, you have to finish your sentence. That's fantastic. I know what you mean about having something to push against, though, like some sort of routine. My writing routine is completely ad hoc. I too have small children. I also have a writing day job, so it's really... when I wrote my first novel, I had one of my daughters would wake up at 5 o'clock on the dot every day. She was like an alarm clock, except you couldn't turn her off like you can with an alarm clock. So I used to write between 5 a.m. and 7 a.m. because that's when Georgia would kick me out of bed. Now she's a little bit older and she sleeps in. So I've lost that part of my day because I can't get out if I don't have a child shaking me. But yeah, it's really ad hoc. It's just when I can.
But having writing as a day job, does that make it easier or harder to then turn to fiction?
I find it easier actually because everything I'm writing otherwise is non-fiction, so it's journalism or other, speech writing or other bits and pieces. I find that's a really different part of my brain. So it's a real, I find it a good thing that they're so different actually.
Hannah?
Oh, look, it's the same thing. I wrote my first 2 books before children. I was so particular about my routine. I would always arrive at the desk at the same time. I would do a particular amount of words. I really protected my time. And then I had 2 children during the writing of Devotion. And I was also balancing that with writing a screenplay as well. And to be honest, I did a really bad job of adjusting to the new hours which I had, which were very few. I mean, I wrote bits of this while breastfeeding, I have babies, newborns. In the end, I think the only thing that helped me get this book over the line was the fact that I had an amazing support in my partner who stopped working so she could have the kids full time, and I basically just worked like a demon for 6 months, all day, nights, weekends, whatever it took just to get it done in time for my deadline. Deadlines I find are incredibly useful. But actually that process was a wonderful one for me because now I am not a fussy writer. I can write anywhere and anything, and I have a renewed ability. I sound like such a... I don't want to swear, but I mean, I think I was probably someone who was very precious in a way that was probably not healthy. I was trying to get into the 19th century, so I would, I didn't want to have the telly on or the radio and all of that sort of thing. And now, I've got kids screaming at me and there's lollipops on my desk and ABC Kids blaring through the wall, and I can still access that point. So in some ways, having that shake-up was actually a massive gift, and I think I'm a much better writer for it. But yeah, I don't want to sort of pretend that I did this on my own. I think many writers, particularly people who are parents of young children, often rely on external support, and that's certainly something that I had.
But you also had a different inbuilt structure with your first novel, didn't you? Because that emerged from PhD.
Yeah, that's true. So I mean, what a gift. A PhD for me at that time. And I should say I haven't finished my PhD. But that was, again, the gift of time and the gift of support, the same things which I think I have been so fortunate and privileged to have with all of my books. Whether that's just someone having faith in you, and respecting the way that you want to protect your writing and protect that time. I think that's huge. I think that a very important component is having that support.
And I just want to add just one small thing to that. So I wrote my second published novel while I was pregnant, and then after I'd given birth to my first child. It has a birth scene in it. Can I tell you? I had to go back and rewrite it.
And there hangs another mythologised
Exactly.
Is there another question? There's one down the front here, in the third row and the second row. So we'll just decide who's going to go first. So there's one here, and then there's the woman in front.
I was just wondering, do you have any advice if I wanted to start writing?
Start writing.
Because I don't know how to end the books.
So it's not about starting writing, which is about bums on seats. It's
Yeah.
how to finish your writing. Is that right?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. Please, I'd like to know the answer to that.
I think it's, it can be really difficult to know when to end things and when to stop writing. And I think without knowing very much of, the work that you're doing, for me, I can only speak from my own experience, when I don't know how to end things, it's because I haven't really finished telling myself the story. And I think this is where the importance of rewriting comes in. For me, I'm not someone who plots out my books, so I never really know how they're going to end when I start. What I do is I just keep drafting, and I sort of find my way there intuitively until the point where I might be 4 or 5 drafts into something until I realise it suddenly has a shape. So I think the important thing there is perhaps just to keep going. And if you're not sure how things are fitting, just to recognise that you're not done telling yourself the story. And once you do understand the story, then that's the time to continue rewriting and to shape it for a reader. That's probably the most succinct way I can put it.
Kate?
Yeah, I'm really keen to answer this one as well. And one of the reasons why I wanted Hannah to answer you first is because we have such different processes. And I think that all of us would. I think whenever you get 3 writers or a room full of writers together, we all create and work in such different ways. And that, I think what you need to do is find out how you're going to work. I'm very different from Hannah because I do plan. I can't start writing until I have the story fully visualised in my imagination. Every story has its own shape, and I'm really interested that you use that term, because that's what I say as well. I need to know the shape of the story before I can start writing. I always need to know my end. And until I have my end, I can't write at all, which sometimes means that I'm waiting, and all my agents and publishers are getting anxious because I'm not writing. And anyone who follows me on social media knows when I'm writing, because I bore you to death with my word counts every single day. My point is, every writer is different. Our creative processes are mysterious even to ourselves sometimes, and that's enchanting and terrifying. And until you know your creative process, you just got to keep on playing and exploring and experimenting and finding what works for you. And then once you have it, then you just got to keep on doing it. And but the story will tell you what it wants to be. The story will show you its shape. And once the shape has revealed itself to you, then it's simply a matter of humbling yourself and trusting in the process.
And reading. There's a really fantastic book about writing by Colin McCann called something like Letters to a Young Writer. And he's got a whole chapter all about the importance of reading. But this intuitive or planning style of writing, crime writers have a very good term for that, and they do it as shorthand. You're either a planner or a pantser, meaning by the seat of your pants. And we've got time for just one final question, which is the woman in the second row.
Thank you for a great session. I was interested in Hannah's comment about multiple truth. So what is more important for you, the historical fact and the historical truth, or your current interpretation and agenda of it?
I think what I'm interested in is kind of just examining even the concept of truth, because I'm not saying that I don't think things are true. That certainly is the case. I think it's more how we sort of accept what is a true story, because I feel that for every story that is told or that we hear, there's another version of it, right? And I think this becomes increasingly so the more that time passes and the more that a story has been retold. So in telling, there's that lovely line, and I don't know who originally said it, but it's the idea of telling lies to tell the truth. And I think for me what that means is looking at these historical stories that receive what hasn't been said, trying to come up with sort of fictional likelihoods, using research to ensure that that is the case. But at the end of the day, the truths that I'm most interested in exploring are very human truths. It's actually not about what happened in the past. It's about things like what it means to be human. And those sorts of things are what I feel are not bound by the historical time period. These are the experiences that mean that we can engage with people who lived in a very different world to us, a very different time, because those experiences mirror our own. So it's those kind of, I guess, emotional truths or those deeper spiritual truths that I think I'm most concentrating on when I write the book. But in terms of whether or not, the archives, we can trust the archives, I think that's another thing. I'm quite comfortable muddying the waters, and I feel quite comfortable sitting in that sense of not quite knowing what we can trust, so long as the focus then is on what we absolutely can trust, which is the what it is to be human, the nature of certain experiences.
And a brief response from the two of you?
Oh, I love that idea of muddying the waters. In this book, Red's best friend Stevie sort of lives by the motto, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. And that's a lot of fun. So story first, story above all, and then, yes, then we can talk about truths.
So for me, I'm often telling the stories of real people who once lived and loved and suffered and sorrowed. And for me, it's very, very important that I honour the truth of what is known about them. So the first thing I do is I establish what I call the known facts, and then what they did, and then I ask myself why. I'm always interested in why people do what they do. I'm looking for some kind of psychological truth, and that's what I'm interested in exploring. Now, sometimes the true facts of someone's life are extremely inconvenient to me. Mm-hmm. For example, in The Wild Girl, when I'm telling the story of the young woman who is the oral source of most of the grim fairy tales, well, it would have been much better to have got her married off at least 25 years earlier, because 25 years of sexual tension is really, really hard to maintain. But I had to do it, because unfortunately she married when I would have liked her to have married. I had to be true to the truth of her life story. So for me, it's a matter of I'm looking for the deeper truth, but once the known facts are established, which is sometimes very difficult, then I would never alter them. I honour them. That's my choice.
Well, thank you so much, the three of you, for the creation of your tender and wild girls. And here at the Words on the Waves festivals, we've been speaking with writers Hannah Kent, Kate Forsyth and Felicity McLean. You will be able to find them and their books at the signing table up the back. Please do thank them.
Thank you.